Today's lesson is going to focus on the development of Greek society and its government. And much of this development has to deal with geography once again. As we saw previously, the landscape of Greece is very mountainous, rugged, rocky, hilly, and interspersed between those are valleys where Greek society is going to develop. The question is, where do you begin developing and building your society? Now, some people might think the mountains because they're high and it gives them added protection. While that's true, it also makes life very difficult for people living on mountaintops or mountainsides. Valley areas, as you can see, might be ideal because they're nice areas of flat open land. But again, valleys are very limited, and this is too valuable of soil for farming, and so this is the least likely spot. Hills were ideal. Hills, again, you get that advantage of elevation. You can see across the valley areas, see if there are threats coming your direction, but they're not as high as mountains. And so when possible, Greeks would seek out hills on which to really start developing their cities and their civilizations. So here you see a hill city. Early on, these were called the development of the polis. Polis is Greek for city. And so these cities began to develop, overseeing the valley areas below and the people working on those valleys. And these cities became really independent of each other. So a city in one valley had its own form of government and own form of culture and lifestyle, whereas the people in the next valley over are developing their own lifestyles. Now again, sometimes these lifestyles are very similar, but each valley area, each city begins to develop its own rules and regulations for itself. This is the development we refer to as a city-state. A city-state is really, as the name implies, it's a city, but it's its own country. It makes its own rules and regulations for its people. At this time, there were not what we would think of as united Greeks. People identified by their city. So somebody in Athens referred to as an Athenian. People in Thebes were Thebians. They didn't call themselves Greeks, even though their cultures were somewhat very similar. When possible, again, building on the hill with fortifications was ideal. This became known as an acropolis. So polis means city, acropo means hill. So this would be nothing more than a hill city. And as mentioned before, hills offered some distinct advantages as far as defenses were considered. Here you can see the Acropolis in Athens. Clearly they built up this retaining wall. You can see in the background, flattened out the hill so which they could build upon it, but it gave the advantage of being line of sight, being able to see over the valley areas. Walls were often built around these cities, another layer of protection. So by the time an attacker had to march up the hill, now they faced walls, and they had to figure out how to get through walls. In the meantime, of course, defenders could be dropping objects upon them, shooting down upon them, gave real advantages as far as the defenders were concerned over attackers. Inside each of these polises or cities, you'd find the famous agora. Bottom right in the box, agora is really kind of the marketplace, the city square, if you will, of Greek cities. This is where all the gatherings are going to take place, public discussions, obviously a marketplace, places for trade and bartering. As you can see in the background on the left, this is also close to the temple. So each of these cities, as we talked about in a previous lesson, would have a temple or temples which would be dedicated to the gods. So this is like the downtown area, if you will, of the Greek polis. This is where all the action and discussions were taking place. When it came to defense, these cities relied upon these individuals known as a hoplite. Hoplite really is defined as a citizen soldier. The key here is the word citizen, not so much soldier. Many of these city-states were so small that they couldn't employ a regular army. So they relied upon their citizens to help defend them. Think of kind of like our National Guard. So when threats came, the citizen soldiers were expected to take up arms to help protect the city. This was one of their duties as part of the polis. Because face it, if they don't defend their city and everybody sits back and say, hey, it's not my job, then the city falls to the attackers and now they've lost everything. Hoplites at this time are responsible for providing their own equipment. So the more you invested in equipment, the better protection you have. Our hoplite here pictured on the left You can see at the very bottom what we think of as like shin guards. These are called greaves, and like today's shin guards, they protect your lower legs. Notice his big bronze shield, which goes really from his shoulder all the way down to his upper thighs. This was to protect the core of his body. He typically wore some type of hard leather body armor, if you will, to protect himself. It usually wasn't metal because that became too cumbersome. He has a sword, but that really wasn't his principal weapon. He's got a helmet. This was used to protect, of course, his head. It did limit his being able to see real well. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And of course, on the left is his principal weapon, the spear. The idea of the hoplite was to keep his enemy at bay, further away from them, because the closer the enemy got to you, the greater chance you could get hurt. Here's one of these styles of helmets that was used to protect them. Another disadvantage of this helmet, besides obstructing some of the vision, was also, of course, it covered their ears, which made it difficult at times for the Greek soldiers to hear in battle. On the right, the horse-haired crest, that red crest up there, was sometimes used to identify commanders, but it also gave the illusion of height to a soldier. So the enemy may see them at the distance and look at how tall they were. It was all really more for show than it was any practical purpose. Here's our hoplite on the march. Notice his big shield protecting his body, his greaves. There's very little of him exposed. About the only thing that is exposed would be his right arm and his right shoulder, right part of his core of his body. That's where this came in. It's known as the phalanx. The phalanx is a fighting formation, and this would be used to help protect the soldiers themselves when they began marching on the attack. It's sometimes referred to as the porcupine, and you can see why. It's just like a porcupine has quills, so does the phalanx, and that's the spears that they carry. So the front ranks, as you see on the bottom left, have their spears lowered, and each succeeding rank has their spears at the ready to help protect the man in the front. If the man in front in battle is wounded or killed, then the man behind him steps up and continues the strength of the phalanx. Here's another great example of the coordination that takes place. And because, again, these big shields overlap, it helps protect the right-hand side of the soldier next to you. And face it, if you had this thing coming at you, I'd be getting out of the way. And that's what many defenders did. The phalanx would often devastate those that it came up against.
The phalanx was the main military formation used by the Greek or Hellenic armies, having been created around 700 BC. It was regarded as a form of heavy infantry, and its soldiers were known as hoplites. As a rule of thumb, the soldier was equipped with a 2.5-meter spear, a large round shield, a short sword, a helmet, chest armor, and greaves. This whole set of equipment would weigh around 35 kilograms, and so the armor was only dressed shortly before battle. In a phalanx, the hoplites remained in a tight formation, basically shoulder to shoulder with their brothers in arms. This was something important for the phalanx's defense, since the shields of a soldier, besides protecting him, covered the right flank of the soldier next to him. Left-handed men were not allowed in a phalanx because of that. To keep the formation unified, a flautist dictated the rhythm of the march. The spear was the phalanx's main weapon, which had an iron spike and a metal latch on the other end. This latch allowed the spear to be stuck in the ground in case of a cavalry attack, and also to keep the weapon properly balanced. In some cases, it could also be used as a bruising weapon, particularly in the case where the spear was broken. The phalanx's wall of spears virtually hampered any form of frontal attack conducted by another infantry division that was not a phalanx as well. This is because they could not hit their opponents without first being stabbed by a spear, and, due to their large shields and heavy armor, attacks with items such as arrows, darts, and stones were barely efficient. When in formation, the first two rows of soldiers pointed their spears forward, while the two rows in back tilted their spears at 45 degrees, hence preventing the possibility of having someone trying to launch an attack over the first line of spears. In turn, the soldiers at the back replaced the fallen colleagues and also pushed their colleagues in front, strengthening the formation. Even though the phalanx was virtually impenetrable in terms of front attacks, since, by being quite a solid body, the phalanx had very little mobility and maneuverability. So, generally, the phalanx had its flanks protected by cavalry or light or minor troops. The only military formation capable of constituting a proper threat to a phalanx was another phalanx. When two units of this kind clashed with each other, usually what decided the battle was the expertise and experience of the hoplites on each side and the number of soldiers in the rear. The powerful Greek phalanx ruled the battlefields in ancient times. Its reign lasted for several centuries until the appearance of the Roman legion, which due to its mobility and employment of brand new tactics, gradually turned the Greek phalanxes into something obsolete.